Close your eyes. Imagine a city. Not a small city, not a village, a metropolis. 500 years before the Spanish arrived, in the middle of a lake in the highlands of Mexico, there was a city called Tenochtitlan. It had a population of perhaps 200,000 people, larger than London at the time, larger than any city in Spain, larger than almost every city in Europe. It had aqueducts that brought fresh water from the mountains. It had floating gardens that produced food for hundreds of thousands. It had temples, markets, schools, hospitals, zoos, botanical gardens, and a legal system that the Spanish invaders, whatever else they thought of the Aztecs, found genuinely impressive. Now go further south, to the Andes Mountains of Peru, where the Inca Empire had constructed a road network of 40,000 kilometers, longer than the Roman road system at its height, crossing some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, where suspension bridges made of woven grass crossed Andean gorges, where a system of information storage and communication using knotted strings, the quipu, recorded everything from census data to poetry. And go further back, to the rainforests of the Yucatan Peninsula, where the Maya had developed a writing system, a mathematical system that included the concept of zero, and an astronomical knowledge so precise that their calendar was more accurate than the one Europe was using at the time. These were not primitive people living in a wilderness that Europeans came to civilize. These were sophisticated, complex, sometimes brutal, always fascinating civilizations that the history we were taught systematically undervalued, misrepresented, and in some cases deliberately lied about. Tonight we correct 10 of those lies. 10 of the biggest misconceptions about the ancient civilizations of Latin America, the Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, and the peoples who came before them, examined properly, set straight, and replaced with the more extraordinary truth. So settle in, let the jungle come alive around you, let the ancient world of the Americas breathe, and let the truth carry you gently to sleep. Lie 1. The Americas were a pristine wilderness before Europeans arrived. Background: dense jungle at night, insects and distant rain, the sounds of a living ancient forest. One of the most persistent and most damaging myths about the ancient Americas is the idea of the pristine wilderness. The story goes like this. Before Europeans arrived in 1492, the Americas were essentially untouched, a vast, empty, natural paradise inhabited by small scattered groups of people living lightly on the land, making no permanent mark on the landscape. It is a myth that served a very convenient purpose for the people who spread it. If the Americas were essentially empty, essentially natural, essentially untouched, then the Europeans who arrived were not conquerors displacing established civilizations. They were simply moving into available space, filling a vacuum. The truth is so different from this myth that it is almost the exact opposite. Archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates that indigenous peoples had a profound impact on the landscape for thousands of years. They developed sophisticated agricultural systems, managed forests, and modified ecosystems to suit their needs. The Amazon rainforest, which popular imagination often presents as the ultimate example of untouched wilderness, was in significant portions a managed landscape. The people of the Amazon had been cultivating it for thousands of years. They created a type of extraordinarily fertile soil called terra preta, dark earth, by deliberately mixing charcoal, bone, and organic matter into the naturally poor Amazonian soil. Areas of terra preta are still more fertile today than the surrounding soil, thousands of years after they were created. The Amazon was not an untouched wilderness, it was a garden, a vast, complex, carefully managed garden. In Mesoamerica, the Maya created extensive agricultural terraces and irrigation systems, transforming the landscape and supporting a large population. The Aztecs created the Chinampas, floating agricultural islands built on the shallow lake bed of Lake Texcoco that were among the most productive farming systems in the ancient world. In North America, the mound-building cultures of the Mississippi Valley constructed massive earthen structures, some of them larger than the Egyptian pyramids, that were ceremonial centers, residences, and astronomical observatories. The population of the Americas before European contact is still debated, but estimates range from 50 to 100 million people. When European diseases, to which indigenous populations had no immunity, swept through the continent in the century after contact, they killed perhaps 90% of the population in some regions. The emptiness that the later European settlers found was not the original state of the Americas. It was the aftermath of one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. The wilderness was created by the conquest. It was not what existed before it. Lie 2, the Aztecs were obsessed with human sacrifice above all else. Background: ancient Mesoamerican city at night, distant drums, warm torchlight, the sounds of a living city. Ask almost anyone what they know about the Aztecs, and within 30 seconds the conversation will arrive at human sacrifice. The sacrifices on the pyramid tops, the beating hearts torn from living chests, the skulls, the blood. It is not a myth that the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice. They did, and at a scale that is genuinely disturbing by any standard. The dedication of the great temple of Tenochtitlan in 1487 involved the sacrifice of thousands of prisoners over several days. The Tzompantli, the skull rack, displayed the heads of sacrificed victims in numbers that astonished the Spanish. Human sacrifice was real. It was central to Aztec religious practice. We should not minimize it. And this is a very large but the image of the Aztecs as a civilization defined primarily by human sacrifice, as a bloodthirsty culture whose primary activity was ritual killing, is a grotesque distortion created by the Spanish conquerors for very specific purposes. The Spanish needed to justify the conquest. The conquest was enormously profitable. The gold and silver of the Americas funded the Spanish Empire for 2 centuries, but it required a moral justification. You could not simply say, "We came here and killed millions of people and took everything they had because we wanted to be rich." You needed to say, "We came here and saved these people from a terrible, demonic, blood-soaked religion. We brought them Christianity and civilization." The human sacrifice made the conquest a rescue operation rather than a crime. The Spanish chroniclers who described Aztec society had every incentive to emphasize the sacrifices and minimize everything else. And so the extraordinary complexity of Aztec civilization, its sophisticated legal system, its mandatory universal education for both boys and girls, which was centuries ahead of Europe, its advanced medicine, its remarkable poetry and literature, its complex theology, was reduced to the image of the priest with the obsidian knife. Tenochtitlan had mandatory schooling for children of all social classes, including girls, at a time when education in Europe was the exclusive preserve of the wealthy and the clergy. It had a sophisticated legal system with courts, judges, and an appeals process. It had markets. The market at Tlatelolco was described by the Spanish as larger and better organized than any market in Spain. The Aztecs were a complex, sometimes brutal, genuinely sophisticated civilization. They were not a civilization defined by one religious practice that their conquerors found it convenient to emphasize. Lie 3. The Maya predicted the end of the world in 2012. Background: ancient Maya jungle observatory at night, stars above the canopy, insects, deep forest silence. On December 21, 2012, the world was supposed to end. Or so the story went. The Maya long count calendar, an extraordinarily sophisticated calendrical system that tracked time in cycles of thousands of years, was reaching the end of one of its great cycles on that date, the 13th B Acton, a period of approximately 5,125 years. And popular culture, books, films, television, documentaries, websites, decided that this meant the Maya had predicted the end of the world. December 21, 2012 came and went. The world did not end. The Maya never predicted it would. The 2012 apocalypse theory was entirely a modern Western invention, projected onto the Maya calendar by people who either did not understand the calendar or who found the apocalypse narrative too commercially attractive to resist. The Maya did not believe the end of a calendar cycle meant the end of the world. They believed it meant the end of one age and the beginning of the next. The Maya conception of time was cyclical rather than linear. Time moved in repeating cycles, and the end of one great cycle was simply the beginning of another, as the end of a year is the beginning of a new one. The Maya themselves, the living descendants of the ancient civilization, were largely bewildered by the 2012 apocalypse narrative. Many of them found it offensive, a misappropriation of their sacred calendar tradition to serve Western entertainment purposes. The Maya long count calendar is one of the most sophisticated timekeeping systems ever devised. It could track dates across millions of years with extraordinary precision. It was designed to be a tool for understanding the flow of time and history, not a countdown to destruction. The 2012 story is a perfect example of a broader problem with how the Maya are treated in popular culture. Their sophisticated intellectual achievements are simultaneously celebrated and distorted, stripped of their actual meaning, and replaced with a narrative that is more exciting to Western audiences, but has nothing to do with what the Maya actually believed. The Maya are still here. Their languages are still spoken. Their calendar traditions are still maintained. They did not disappear in 2012 or at any other time. Which brings us to the next lie. Lie 4. The Maya mysteriously disappeared. Background: overgrown Maya ruins at night, jungle reclaiming ancient stone, soft rain, frogs and insects. The Maya collapse, the mysterious disappearance of a great civilization. The cities swallowed by the jungle, the people vanished, the writing unread, the temples left to the trees. It is one of the most dramatic narratives in popular archaeology, and it is fundamentally misleading. The Maya never disappeared. What happened in the 9th and 10th centuries AD was a collapse of the classic Maya city-states of the southern lowlands, the great centers like Tikal and Palenque and Copan. These cities declined, their populations dispersed, the monumental construction stopped. The reasons were multiple and complex: prolonged drought, soil exhaustion from intensive agriculture, political instability, warfare between competing city-states. The same combination of environmental and political pressures that has ended many civilizations. But the Maya people did not disappear. They continued to live in the Yucatan Peninsula and the highlands of Guatemala. The northern cities, Chichen Itza, Uxmal, continued to flourish for centuries after the southern collapse. New city-states emerged. Trade networks continued. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they did not find an empty jungle. They found a living Maya civilization with millions of people, functioning cities, active trade networks, and ongoing cultural and religious traditions. There was, in fact, an independent Maya kingdom that remained unconquered until 1697, nearly 2 centuries after the Spanish conquest of Mexico. The Itza Maya of the Petén region in what is now Guatemala maintained their independence for longer than many European kingdoms have existed. Today, between 6 and 7 million Maya people live in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They speak approximately 30 distinct Maya languages. They maintain cultural and ceremonial traditions that connect them to the ancient civilization. The Maya did not mysteriously disappear. Their cities were abandoned, their written tradition was nearly destroyed by the Spanish, who burned most of their books in acts of deliberate cultural destruction, but the people survived. They are still here. Live 5, the Inca built Machu Picchu as a fortress. Background: high Andean mountains at night, cold wind, stars at altitude, distant condor call, vast open sky. Machu Picchu, the most famous archaeological site in South America. The stone city in the clouds, perched on a ridge between two mountain peaks in the Peruvian Andes, its terraces and temples and astronomical alignments drawing over 1 million visitors a year. It is often described in popular culture as an Inca fortress, a military stronghold, a place of refuge high in the mountains where the Inca could defend themselves against enemies. It was almost certainly not a fortress. The current understanding of Machu Picchu among archaeologists is that it was a royal estate, a private retreat built for the Inca Emperor Pachacuti in the mid-15th century. Not a military installation, but something more like a royal country palace, a place for the emperor and his court to spend time away from the capital, Cusco, to conduct certain religious ceremonies, and to enjoy the extraordinary landscape. The evidence for this interpretation is significant. The site has none of the defensive features you would expect in a fortress. No walls designed to repel attackers, no strategic sightlines for defense, no evidence of a garrison. What it does have is an elaborate system of astronomical alignments, windows and doorways precisely positioned to frame the rising sun on specific dates, a large ceremonial plaza, extensive agricultural terraces, and evidence of careful planning by skilled architects. The alignment of the Intihuatana stone, a carved granite ritual stone at the highest point of the site, is precisely calibrated to mark the position of the sun at the winter solstice. This is not the work of military engineers building a defensive position. It is the work of astronomers and ceremonial planners building a sacred space. Machu Picchu was abandoned before the Spanish conquest or shortly afterward. The reasons are unclear. Because it was never mentioned in Spanish colonial records, it was unknown to the outside world until 1911, when the American explorer Hiram Bingham III was led to it by local Quechua farmers. Bingham spent years excavating the site and removing artifacts to Yale University, a removal that Peru spent a century trying to reverse. The artifacts were finally returned to Peru in 2011 and 2012. The farmers who led Bingham to the site already knew it was there, of course. The local people had never lost track of the ruins. The mystery was only a mystery to the outside world. Lie 6, the Spanish conquered Latin America because they were technologically superior. Background: tropical coastal night, Spanish ships visible in moonlight on dark water, the sound of a world about to change. The standard narrative of the Spanish conquest of Latin America has a simple explanation: superior technology. The Spanish had guns, They had steel swords and steel armor. They had horses which the Americas had not seen before. Against these advantages, the indigenous peoples of Mexico and Peru were helpless. The outcome was inevitable. The conquest was a demonstration of European technological and therefore civilizational superiority. This explanation is incomplete in ways that matter. The Spanish conquests of Mexico and Peru were not primarily won by technological advantage. They were won by disease, by political manipulation, and by the strategic use of indigenous allies who had their own reasons for wanting to see the Aztec and Inca empires destroyed. When Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519 with 550 men, he did not conquer the Aztec Empire. He could not have. The Aztec Empire had armies of tens of thousands, sophisticated military traditions, and defensive advantages that made direct military conquest by 500 men impossible. What he did was find the Aztec Empire's enemies. The Aztec Empire was not a unified, peaceful state. It was an empire that extracted tribute and sacrificial victims from conquered peoples who deeply resented their subjugation. The Tlaxcalans, a people who had resisted Aztec conquest and maintained their independence, became Cortés's most important allies. The final siege of Tenochtitlan was fought primarily by a Tlaxcalan army, with a small Spanish force as shock troops and artillery support. The fall of Tenochtitlan was largely a Tlaxcalan military operation that Cortés organized and participated in. And even then, what finally destroyed the Aztec Empire was not Spanish swords or guns, it was smallpox. The epidemic that swept through Tenochtitlan in 1520 killed perhaps half the city's population, including the Emperor Cuitlahuac, who had successfully expelled Cortés from the city in the Noche Triste. The population collapse caused by disease, to which the indigenous population had zero immunity, was the decisive factor in the conquest of the Americas. In Peru, Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire similarly depended on arriving at a moment of catastrophic civil war. The Inca Empire had been riven by a succession war between two brothers when Pizarro arrived, and he was able to seize one of the brothers and use the political chaos to his advantage. The Spanish were militarily capable and technologically advantaged in some respects, but they did not conquer two of the largest empires in the world with a few hundred men because of technology. They conquered them with disease, political opportunism, and indigenous allies whose own political calculations led them into a partnership that ultimately destroyed all of them. Lie 7. The Inca had no writing system. Background: high-altitude Inca settlement at night, llamas moving in the darkness, cold Andean wind, distant mountain stream. One of the things that the European conquerors used to justify their contempt for the Inca civilization was the claim that it had no writing. Writing in the European tradition was the mark of civilization. Without it, you were primitive. Without it, you could not be truly organized, truly sophisticated, truly capable of the complex administration that a great empire requires. The Inca had no writing, therefore the Inca were not truly civilized. The problem with this argument is that the Inca did have a system of recording and transmitting information. It was not a writing system in the European sense, but it was sophisticated enough to administer an empire of 12 million people across 4,000 miles of the Andes. It was called the quipu. The quipu, also spelled quipu, was a system of knotted strings, a central cord from which hung dozens or hundreds of pendant strings, each of which could carry further subsidiary strings. The strings were made of various fibers: cotton, llama wool in various colors. The knots tied into the strings varied in type, position, and number. The quipu was used to record numerical information, census data, tax records, storage inventories, tribute accounts. The Inca state maintained a corps of specialists called quipu quipu keepers, who could read and create quipus and who carried them as official records throughout the empire. But recent scholarship has suggested that the quipu may have recorded more than just numbers. Some researchers, analyzing the patterns of color and not type in surviving quipus, have argued that they may encode narrative information, stories, histories, administrative records of a non-numerical kind. If this is correct, the quipu was not merely an accounting tool but something closer to writing, a system for recording and transmitting complex information that simply looked completely different from anything in the European tradition. The debate is ongoing and unresolved, but the certain fact is that the Inca administered one of the largest empires in the ancient world without the kind of writing system that Europeans considered necessary, and did it successfully for centuries across extraordinarily difficult terrain. The absence of alphabetic writing does not mean the absence of sophisticated information management. It means the presence of a different solution to the same problem. Lie 8 Ancient Latin American civilisations were isolated from each other. Background: ancient trade route at night, the sound of travelers and llamas on a mountain path, distant fire, stars above the Andes. The image of ancient Latin American civilizations that popular culture most often presents is one of isolation. Separate, self-contained worlds, the Maya in their jungles, the Aztecs in their lake city, the Inca in their mountains, each civilization operating in its own bubble, unaware of or unconnected to the others. The reality was almost exactly the opposite. The ancient civilizations of Latin America were deeply connected by trade networks that covered enormous distances and exchanged goods, ideas, and technologies across what we now think of as separate cultural spheres. Cacao, chocolate, originated in Mesoamerica and was traded northward into what is now the American Southwest and southward toward South America. Turquoise from the American Southwest appeared in Mesoamerican markets. Copper bells produced in western Mexico have been found at Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, over 2,000 kilometers away. Macaw feathers from Mesoamerica appeared in the American Southwest. The distinctive Mesoamerican ball game, played with a rubber ball on a formal court, spread across an enormous area, with ball courts found from Arizona to Honduras. The Inca road network, 40,000 kilometers of engineered roads crossing the Andes, was specifically designed to facilitate trade and communication across the empire. It connected the coastal lowlands with the Andean highlands with the Amazon basin, allowing goods to move between radically different ecological zones. The exchange of agricultural technologies was particularly important. Crops domesticated in one region spread across enormous distances. Maize, domesticated in Mexico around 9,000 years ago, had reached South America by 3000 BC and the eastern woodlands of North America by 900 AD. Potatoes, domesticated in the Andes, spread northward. Quinoa, tomatoes, chilies, squash. The extraordinary diversity of crops that the Americas gave to the world was the product of thousands of years of agricultural development and exchange across the continent. The ancient Americas were not isolated worlds. They were a connected web of civilizations, trading and exchanging ideas and technologies across distances that seem remarkable even today. Line 9 Aztec and Inca medicine was primitive and superstitious. Background: ancient Mesoamerican healers garden at night, herbs and plants in moonlight, soft warm air, the smell of the night garden. When we think of ancient medicine, we often think of superstition and ineffective ritual, witch doctors and magic rather than genuine medical knowledge. This image is particularly attached to the indigenous civilizations of the Americas, whose medical traditions were almost entirely dismissed by the European conquerors as primitive nonsense. The reality was considerably more sophisticated. The Aztecs had a medical tradition of genuine effectiveness, rooted in centuries of careful empirical observation of the natural world. The Aztec herbal pharmacopoeia, the systematic knowledge of which plants could treat which conditions, was so impressive that when the Spanish physician Francisco Hernandez was sent by Philip II of Spain to document Aztec medicinal knowledge in the 1570s, he spent 7 years cataloguing over 3,000 plants, animals, and minerals used in Aztec medicine, producing a work of 11 volumes. Many of the treatments he documented have been validated by modern pharmacology. The Aztecs used the bark of the willow tree, which contains salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin, as a pain reliever and fever reducer. They used various plants with genuine antibiotic properties. They used the sap of certain cacti as a wound treatment that prevented infection with real effectiveness. The Aztec understanding of hygiene was also sophisticated. Tenochtitlan had a sewage system. It had regular rubbish collection. Public baths were common. Personal cleanliness was emphasized in a way that was, frankly, ahead of contemporary European practice. A Spanish soldier accompanying Cortés noted with some surprise that the Aztecs bathed much more frequently than the Spanish. The Inca medical tradition included a procedure that was genuinely extraordinary by the standards of any ancient culture: trepanation, the surgical opening of the skull. Archaeological evidence from Inca and pre-Inca sites shows that trepanation was performed with a success rate, as measured by evidence of bone healing around the surgical site, of up to 80%. Patients survived, they recovered, they lived with holes in their skulls. This was brain surgery in the ancient Andes, centuries before European medicine had developed comparable techniques. The medical knowledge of the ancient civilizations of Latin America was not primitive. It was different from European medicine, and in some respects it was more effective. Lie 10, the Spanish conquest, brought civilization to the Americas. Background: post-conquest Latin American night, church bells in the distance, the sounds of a transformed world, melancholy and still. The final and perhaps the largest lie. The story that the Spanish conquest of Latin America was fundamentally a civilizing mission, that the peoples of the Americas were brought from darkness into light, from barbarism into Christianity, from primitive chaos into European order. This story was told by the Spanish at the time, and it has echoed in various forms through 5 centuries of history. It is, at its core, a justification for one of the largest demographic catastrophes in human history. Let us be clear about what the Spanish conquest actually brought to Latin America. Disease: the epidemics of smallpox, measles, typhus, and other European diseases to which the indigenous population had no immunity killed between 50 and 90% of the pre-contact population in the century after contact. In Mexico, the population fell from perhaps 25 million in 1519 to perhaps 1 million by 1620. In Peru, from perhaps 12 million to perhaps 600,000. The scale of the mortality is almost impossible to grasp. The destruction of knowledge, the Spanish systematically destroyed the written records of the civilizations they conquered. Bishop Diego de Landa burned virtually all the Maya books in 1562, the codices that contain the accumulated astronomical, historical, and religious knowledge of one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas. Only 4 Maya books survive today. We cannot know what was in the ones that burned. The destruction of institutions. The Aztec schools, which provided universal education to both boys and girls, were replaced by Spanish institutions that served the Spanish colonial population. The Inca road network fell into disuse. The sophisticated agricultural systems, the Chinampas, the Andean terraces, the Amazonian terra preta management, were abandoned as the population collapsed, and the knowledge of how to maintain them died with the people who possessed it. The encomienda system, the labor arrangement by which the Spanish crown granted indigenous people to Spanish settlers, was, in practice, a system of forced labor that was barely distinguishable from slavery. None of this means that pre-Columbian Latin America was a paradise. The Aztec Empire extracted brutal tribute from conquered peoples. The Inca Empire was authoritarian. Human sacrifice was real. Warfare was endemic. But the argument that the Spanish conquest brought civilization to a barbaric people is a story told by the people who benefited from the conquest about the people they destroyed. It is not history, it is justification. The civilizations of ancient Latin America were extraordinary. They were sophisticated and complex and sometimes brutal, as all great civilizations are. They deserved to be engaged with on their own terms, understood on their own terms, judged on their own terms. They were not given that, and the lie that they needed saving, that the conquest was a rescue, has been used to justify what was done to them for 500 years. Understanding that lie and why it was told, and whose purposes it served, that is perhaps the most important thing we can take from tonight. Closing, the jungle remembers. And so our 10 lies come to rest. The pristine wilderness that was not a wilderness, the Aztecs reduced to their sacrifices, the Maya who never disappeared, the 2012 apocalypse that was never predicted, Machu Picchu the fortress that was a palace, the technological conquest that was actually disease and politics, the Inca who had no writing but administered an empire, the isolated civilizations that were deeply connected, the primitive medicine that included brain surgery, the civilizing mission that was a catastrophe. 10 lies, 10 corrections. And beneath them all, a larger truth. The ancient civilizations of Latin America were extraordinary, not in spite of being different from Europe, but because of it. They solved the problems of agriculture and administration and astronomy and medicine and communication in ways that were genuinely different from the solutions that emerged in the Old World, and sometimes in ways that were genuinely better. The Amazon is still here, carrying the memory of the gardens that were built in it. The Andean terraces are still carved into the mountainsides, even where no one farms them anymore. The quipus are in museums, still not fully understood. The Maya languages are still spoken. The descendants of the Aztecs and the Inca and the Maya are still living in the places their ancestors built. The lies told about them did not erase them. Nothing quite erased them. Let those corrections settle around you now, like warm rain on the jungle canopy. The city of Tenochtitlan, 200,000 people on a lake larger than London. The quipu keeper reading his knotted strings in the Andean cold. The Maya astronomer tracking Venus across the centuries. The Inca surgeon with his trepanning tools and his 80% survival rate. The terra preta garden in the Amazon, still fertile after 2,000 years. Let the truth replace the lies. Let the real ancient Americas settle into place. And sleep. A soft, deep, dreamless sleep. A good night.